I'd like to welcome all of you back from lunch. I hope everyone's had a pleasant lunch. And we're looking forward to the second half of this symposium. I'm Kathryn Saterson with the Center for Environmental Solutions here at Duke University. I'm very pleased to moderate this panel on forests and wilderness management. We've had a good general overview this morning about natural resource policy under the Bush administration and a more specific focus on legislation related to biological resource conservation. I'm sure many of you are aware of this game, Paradigm Shift Bingo, where you listen during a conference for the number of times you hear the term paradigm shift, and with a direct correlation between the number of times you hear a paradigm shift and how pompous or academic a conference is. Well, I was listening this morning, and I don't think I heard paradigm shift once, which is terrific. And I don't want to take away anyone's notes from the afternoon, but if you've got that in your talk, anyway, we won't have students standing up and saying bingo, I hope, during the afternoon. Well, legislation has clearly, and I think that Doug Wheeler made this point this morning, that clearly legislation has improved in the last 50 years in terms of being more integrated and more interdisciplinary, but we still have far to go. Our laws are still basically written around specific sectors, and I think one could argue as we talk about this administration or another administration that basically everyone is not doing a very good job, be they NGO from whatever perspective or whatever administration, in terms of articulating what is our environmental and natural resource goal, what are we trying to achieve, and what are our measures of success going to be to get there. So I think in the discussion this afternoon, we'll have plenty of opportunity to think about how we do better environmental management. Coming from the Center for Environmental Solutions, we're focusing on those interdisciplinary solutions, and I think we can move from this discussion into that broader perspective. This panel, I think, will help us begin to get there as we think about forest management and wilderness management and specific issues that are being considered in terms of roads and fire management. We have two very distinguished speakers, Charlene or Charlie Coon from the Heritage Institute and Gloria Flora from the group Sustainable Obtainable Solutions. I will direct you to their biographies in the briefing books that explain their very extensive experience. So we'll go straight to the talk since we're starting a little bit late, and Charlie Coon is first.
Just like church. I think I'll put this here. Okay, I'm going to give you a warning ahead of time. If I start rambling or talking too fast, just let me know. I'm full of caffeine. I took the scenic route getting here today and got about 2 hours of sleep last night. So I really have had a lot of caffeine. That was not my first Diet Coke today. So I just wanted to give you a fair warning on that. I also understand that I'll be very familiar with the procedures here today because we used to do this on the Hill when your 5 minutes was up giving your presentation. They cut you off. They have the little light bulbs, the yellow, the red, and the green. And when the red one goes on, your mic gets cut. So you might want to think about that for the future. Just cut the mic. Well, I'm very pleased to be here, and I thank you very much. I want to thank Christopher and where's Patricia, wherever she is, for inviting me. Well, I think you heard this morning, or at least I hope you got the impression this morning that for many, many, many years, we've had a forest policy of leave the woods alone crowd. We're not supposed to do anything. Leave them alone. And they've led the way in making our forest policy for at least the past 40 years, if not for the past century. And what this has led to is that we've been left with a lot of brush and disease, which has festered. And this has happened despite indisputable evidence that absolute, mind you, I'm saying absolute suppression and stifled harvesting imperils the forest. It imperils the environment, the habitat. And to quote from, and I do not know which part of the Bible this is, but we reap what we sow. I think we're seeing that we're seeing what has happened with this kind of a hands-off policy. Our forests are unnaturally, and that's a key, unnaturally dense, diseased, and insect infested. And as a result, they're just tinderboxes, either already on fire, as we recently saw in California, or susceptible to spectacular blazes. We're talking catastrophic fires here with a careless camper or a bolt of lightning, an act of God, for heaven's sakes. That happened to me yesterday with the wind, an act of God. This hands-off policy, we really started seeing the results of this in 2000. The year 2000, was the worst fire season in 50 years for the United States. And last year alone, we lost more than 7 million acres to fire, 23 firefighters, not to mention the thousands of structures that were destroyed, as well as tens of thousands of people who were forced to evacuate their homes. And those numbers don't even include what the 750,000 acres that we saw from this past fire in California. And this hands-off policy is directly responsible for why the Forest Service has said that 70 million acres are at extreme risk, and an additional 120 million acres unnatural risk of devastating fires. And the forest and management experts all agree that we will continue to see more of these if we do not change our ways. And people, I think you heard earlier, people are moving. I think the lady up here mentioned the fact that people are moving closer to the woods. And that is one reason that we need to have active and good sound forest management policy. But even if people weren't, even if they were not moving near the woods, we need to take some action. The hands-off policy, we've tried. It's a failed policy. We've seen the results. It's time to change. It's time to take control. The status quo has created unhealthy, unsafe, and unsustainable forests. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him, but he did testify at a hearing on Capitol Hill. Thomas Bonixton, who is the forest ecologist and the director of Department of Forest Science at Texas A&M, who has testified and studied that we have, the forest density that we have now is 10 times what it should be. You have 300 trees where under natural conditions you would have 30. And that means that they're fighting for the nutrients, they're fighting for the water. It makes them more susceptible to disease, insect infestation, throw in another act of God, the drought, and you just have a recipe for a catastrophic wildfire. Many people will say, well, the wildfires, they're natural, and we should have these, and it will clean up the forest, it'll cleanse the forest, it will maintain its health. Well, not these types of fires. These are a different breed. Because we have so much excessive brush, or fuel load is kind of the jargon, on the ground, the fires are unnaturally hot, and as a result, when they catch on fire, they become catastrophic forest fires, and they don't help the wildlife, like some would say that the natural fires do. These fires, these intense fires, do not help the wildlife. They destroy it. They don't clear the habitats. They consume them. They sterilize the soil, and they pollute the air and the water. Because they burn so hot, it makes it difficult for the firefighters to even be able to control them or to handle them. And it allows them to spread over vast areas. And I don't know if anybody has ever actually seen a forest fire firsthand. I certainly haven't, but I've seen photos and snapshots of them. A forest fire can jump railroad tracks. I mean, if there's a wind, it can jump railroad tracks. It can travel 2 or 3 miles. I mean, it can travel miles. And all you have to do is think of, I don't know if it was windy here yesterday, but just think of that wind yesterday. If you had, you know, all of this dense brush and a drought, and then you had some careless, let's just say it was some careless camper who threw a match down, and then you had all that wind, pretty difficult to contain that. That's why we need forest management. We're talking about forest management. Management is another word for maintenance. If you do not maintain your property, you do not maintain your home, you do not maintain your car, you do not maintain your health, eventually it's going to catch up with you, and eventually you're going to pay a price for it. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. To make matters worse, in addition to all of the density and the policy of a hands-off policy on our forests, we've also had bureaucratic rules, tons of them. I mean, earlier today we were hearing about them. You can't keep track of the number of bureaucratic rules and frivolous lawsuits, and as a result of those, we have seen that these impede any types of, not any types, but most types of common sense thinning and fuel reduction projects. Not to mention, in addition to that, we see the bureaucrats spending an inordinate amount of time with paperwork as a result of these bureaucratic rules and frivolous lawsuits, multiple analysis. I mean, just think of an EA, environmental analysis, then think how much you have to put in for an EIS, environmental impact statement. And you're having to do this for every single project to protect yourself so that you don't have a lawsuit. Think of the time that goes into that. That's lost time that could be used better to manage the forest, to maintain the forests. Then we also have, you know, just the regular bureaucratic bottlenecks. In fact, the Congress recently, Chairman Pombo, who is Congressman Pombo from California, is the chairman of the House Resources Committee, has had several hearings, and in fact, they have been told by the forest management workers and the Department of Interior that and Agriculture that 40% of their resources are used for litigation and for other roadblocks. Now, this 40%, that's almost half of their time is spent just trying to cover their fannies, if you will. In California, and this was done by the General Accounting Office in Washington, D.C., the U.S. General Accounting Office. For California alone, in the last 2 years, two-thirds of the Forest Service thinning projects were appealed. And let me say something else about those that were appealed. Of those that were appealed, only 10% were reversed. Some of these projects, we don't know. Perhaps they could have prevented some of the fires that we had, perhaps not. But maybe they could have at least minimized the effects or the potential of a catastrophic fire that we have seen from these appeals by activist groups. The leave it alone forest crowd needs to just face the facts. The hands-off policy hasn't worked. Their litigation, their delays, their prevention of sound forest management policy, it's had results. It's cost people their lives, firefighters. It has cost wildlife their lives, habitat, people's homes, structures. Our forests are not safe and they're not healthy, and we need to change our ways. And because of all of the bureaucratic roadblocks that we have, we kind of coined this, according to what Chairman Pombo has said in Washington, D.C., we have a paralysis by analysis. I mean, you can analyze something to death, but then eventually you've got to act. You have to do what is right. And we need we need a process where we can have some action. And right now, there is a paralysis by analysis. We need to change this process. And that is some of what the President's Healthy Forest Plan is all about. It is a roadmap back to sensible forest policies so that we have our forests in their natural states. And I wish I had, I don't have it here, but I've got it in my bag over there. I have some pictures that will show you what the forest looked like maybe 100 years ago. And then there's another photo of what it looks like now. And there's a stark difference because now you can't even see, through the trees because there are so many trees. Again, we need to maintain our forests. The President's Healthy Forest Plan does this in part by streamlining the the administrative appeals process and the court challenges. And again, this is only up to 20 million acres of the forest. And for those who advocate that this is basically taking over the forest and handing it over to the timber companies, it is only 20 million acres. It's near residential areas. It's near municipal watersheds, near threatened and endangered species, and where the trees are infected with certain insects. So it is narrow. They also will develop one plan, and what is for those 20 million acres, what is removed from that is an option of doing absolutely nothing. We've seen what absolutely nothing does. That policy has failed. You heard earlier today that the House passed, I think they said the House passed, it's called the Healthy Forest Restoration Plan and Restoration Act of 2003. If you're following legislation, it's H.R. 1904. It passed in May, well before the California fires, by a bipartisan vote of 256 to 170. The Senate, however, it's a different story. They were stalling the bill. They were going to talk the bill to death. But Mother Nature took over. We had the forest fires in California, and as a result of those forest fires, the Senate, were forced to move and pass the Healthy Forest legislation. They passed it October 30th, just recently, by an overwhelming 80 to 14. Now, that sounds good, and everybody earlier people were saying that's great, it's moving forward. Well, here's the little story from Washington, D.C. on this. Many of the members are not that concerned about the goal of sound forest management. Political gamesmanship is being played again. The House already has appointed conferees. They have to have, there are two versions of the bill, House and the Senate. They have to have a conference to reconcile those differences. The House has responsibly appointed conferees. The Senate Republicans have at least recommended a slate, but the Democratic leadership is dragging their feet again. And why I say again is last spring, two senators, we had Senator Tom Harkin from Iowa and Jeff Bingaman from New Mexico, put holds on the bill. Now, if you're not familiar with the legislative process, all that does is that holds it up. If you are one senator and you want to put a hold on a bill, you can stop that legislation from ever seeing the light of day. What they have done now is they are dragging their feet on the conference committee. They can put out their press releases and they can go home and tell their constituents that they are for sound, healthy management of the forest because, well, gee, I voted for the bill. It was 80 to 14. It's not going to be law unless we have a conference committee. And if the Senate leadership, the Senate Democrat leadership, does not move on a conference committee, we're not going to have these changes. We are not going to have these improvements to the law. I think my time is running out. I don't know how, I've got 1 minute left, okay. I guess what I'd like to close on real quickly is that the hands-off policy just hasn't worked. It has failed, and it's human-induced. It's by our human intervention or lack thereof that we have these dense forests, that we have the potential for these catastrophic forest fires. And we need to change. We need to ensure that we have sound management, sound maintenance. Again, I cannot emphasize enough that we're talking about maintenance. And I just want to respond to something that you said earlier. I do have a response to your answer. I think when we look at resource policy, when we look at environmental policy, we have to look at, and I'm sorry to bring up, some more alphabet soup, but I think we need the 3 E's. And that is what we're looking at. You cannot look at the environment without taking into consideration the impact that it has on energy and the impact that it has on the economy. They all 3 are linked. You cannot segregate them. And for too long, we have segregated them, and we've gone off with environmental laws. My time's up. On this, in this direction, and then the economy is going this, not thinking what the impact's going to be over here, or on energy. And the policymakers need to start looking at the interrelation between the environment, which is natural resources, includes natural resources, energy, and the economy. Thank you.
Greetings. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's nice to change habitats and look at something completely different than I'm accustomed to. I'm going to talk very quickly because I have a lot to say. I really would almost like to debate what some of the things that Charlie had to say, because I've spent over 23 years, or excuse me, over 22 years, almost 23 in the Forest Service, so I was where the rubber met the road, and I never saw the hands-off policy that she's talking about. So we'll talk about that later when we start our discussion. I want to talk today with you about the Roadless Area Conservation Rule, or the Roadless Initiative as it was called. I want to give you some history and some field perspective. I truly believe that the Roadless Area Conservation Rule is a very innovative approach to solving a long-term problem, and that is that the endless wrangling over wildlands and the transportation system within the U.S. Forest Service. Excuse me. A little bit of history. There's always been a national imperative to protect roadless areas or protect those wildlands. It started back in the 1920s. Arthur Carhart and Aldo Leopold, at the time both Forest Service employees, started an inventory and identified quite a few primitive areas. By 1964, when we finally got the Wilderness Management Act, those primitive areas actually formed the basis of the wilderness system. The Wilderness Management Act also directed the Forest Service to further inventory lands that may be potentially designated as wilderness. This was called the Roadless Area Review and Evaluation, or RARE 1. And RARE 1 was completed in 1972, and it was a rather awkward approach to identifying lands and deemed quite incomplete not only by the public but by the court system and the Carter administration. So the Forest Service was directed to go back and try it again, this time something a little more simplified, streamlined, and faster. So throughout the 70s, the Forest Service was conducting RARE 2. Actually, I remember when I first started in the Forest Service in 1977, I was taking a tour of the office and walked into the graphics section, and there were these huge maps spread all over the place, and this fellow started explaining RARE 2 to me. So that long ago, it was still in the works. By 1979, RARE 2 was completed, and 62 million acres of inventoried roadless were identified. Of those 62 million acres, about a quarter of them were recommended for potential inclusion in wilderness in the wilderness system, and 60% were suggested to be released for multiple use. There was dissatisfaction with that conclusion on both sides of the argument, but about that time we also saw the advent of the National Forest Management Act planning rules. And so it was determined that instead of going through some more protracted court battles over this, that we would just allow forest plans on a case-by-case basis to look at the inventoried road list and determine what interim management should be. So what was really happening in the Forest Service at this time? Let's set the scene. One thing I will tell you is that as a forest supervisor, I would bet the majority, and from my own personal experience, I know this is true, the biggest problem in national forest management is access. That means the transportation system. This has been over 30 years of intense debate. It's where are we going to put the roads? How are we going to mitigate the impacts of the roads? How are we going to pay for the roads? How are we going to pay for the maintenance of the roads? What traffic should be allowed on the roads and when? And how are we going to deal with all these complaints about the condition of the roads? All those were consistent problems. Actually, travel planning and dealing with roadless lands, which are very closely linked, caused countless headaches, endless litigation, and also more Forest Service employees were hung in effigy over travel plans than any other issue, which is a very good way of gauging public interest. Literally, we had more roads than we could shake a stick at. We had more roads than we knew what to do with. Why do I say that? The Forest Service has 380,000 miles of road. Let's put that in perspective. That's 10 times the mileage in the interstate system. Of that, only 10,000 miles of those roads are paved. We spend in the Forest Service about, well, rather than dollars, 12% of those roads per year are maintained. That's about it. Now, that's a problem because most of those roads that are maintained are roads that need to be maintained at least once a year, if not more frequently. That doesn't leave much, if any, left over for the rest of the road system. Now, how did we get all those roads? Well, 80% of those roads were built through trading timber for road construction. That's also called purchaser road credit. That was mostly done in the 70s and the 80s. That purchaser road credit also paid for road maintenance. So a quality road system was also dependent on having a very active and aggressive timber program. My comment about the leave alone timber management, actually my experience is that in the 70s, we started that decade with a harvest of about 4 billion board feet per year. We ramped that up. By the end of the 70s, we were harvesting 12 billion board feet per year. 12 billion board feet continued to be the average per year throughout the 80s. It was only into the 90s when we suddenly started ramping down rather significantly and precipitously, I will say. And that was based not only on the unsustainable level of harvest that we were doing, but it was also how we were harvesting, where we were harvesting, and it was also based on changing public perception and on politics. I dare say now that we are down to less than 2 billion board feet per year, and I don't think that's sufficient. I do agree with Charlie that we do need more active management in already roaded areas. I definitely am not a supporter of the zero-cut policy. I think that's wrong-headed, ecologically primarily. So with the decline in timber and this trading for road maintenance and road construction, it suddenly dawned on the Forest Service that we were going to have to get this money from somewhere. So we went to Congress and said, geez, you've really got to give us more money for roads. We're really hurting here. We have huge liability problems, huge ecological problems with these roads. And the Congress rightly said, well, what is your backlog? What are your real needs? So we proceeded finally in the late 90s to identify what our real needs were. $8.2 billion to fix the road system in the Forest Service. Kind of makes you wonder what business sense it makes to build more roads when we already have so many. But what else did we discover during this time frame, particularly in the 80s and the 90s? One is that science is very clear on how roads interact with the environment. Roads, especially roads that aren't maintained, create erosion. They lead to stream sedimentation. Roads at densities of greater than 1 mile per square mile have a very deleterious effect on wildlife habitat. And for instance, with elk, it will reduce habitat effectiveness by 50% with just 1 mile per square mile. Also, roads introduce noxious weeds, and also roads give people access to the forest, which is a great thing. However, in the terms of forest fires, most forest fires are caused by humans, and humans are primarily in the roaded areas. Roadless acres have dwindled from, during this time, roadless acres dwindled from 62 million to 58.5 million. However, of that 58.5 million, 3 million of that actually have roads in them right now. Half of the inventoried roadless areas are part or all of municipal watersheds. That is, the places where counties and communities get their water, their drinking water. That's 42 million acres of national forest supplies municipal water. Also, we really started to have to question where did these assumptions about this timber volume that was theoretically in roadless areas come from? Well, where it came from was based on forest planning in the, that was developed through the late 80s. And the Committee of Scientists and a number of other investigative reports have demonstrated that the computer model that we were using to produce forest plans at that time was not a resource allocation model as it was claimed. It was actually a timber optimization model. So with the political pressure that was on the Forest Service to maintain those high level of cuts that were seen during the 70s and 80s, the Forest Service said, oh, well, yeah, we know where to get that timber. It's in this blank space in the map. We're sure it's there. So we said that we could get timber in volumes equal to what we had been producing, but we were going to get them from these vast roadless areas where we really had very, very insufficient timber data to even tell us whether that was possible or not. But it was a real good way of getting the political heat turned down. Also, what did we discover? Well, the Forest Service is really a fairly small player in the national resource or natural resource production arena. The Forest Service produces or is responsible for producing about 4% of the timber in this country, slightly less than 5% of the beef, and 0.4% of the oil and gas. So we're really not huge players in the natural resource market, although we like to think we were. So fundamentally, you need to ask yourself an even more basic question. That is, why are these roadless areas still roadless? Well, they're roadless for very good reasons. First and probably foremost is topography and what's there. These are usually in very steep areas or areas that are difficult to access, very wet areas. They have primarily grass, shrubs, rocks, ice, along with trees. If there were extractable resources there, 9 times out of 10, it's economically not feasible to build the roads to go in and get these resources. They just don't have that high of value. And even with subsidies, which the National Forest System subsidizes every activity, recreation, grazing, timber, you name it, it's subsidized. Even with subsidies, it's insufficient to pay for getting those resources out. We've had over 100 years to choose to road national forests. If it's not roaded in 100 years, you've got to wonder why. Also, so finally, I think it dawned on the Forest Service that we had a very serious problem with our transportation system and with roadless, and that we indeed were the most appropriate people or group to do something about it, and that it was well past time to take action. That led to the promulgation or the suggestion of what was called the Roadless Initiative at the time that led to the roadless rule. And I've got to tell you that internally in the Forest Service, regardless of where you were as far as your personal position on should we road, should we not road, where, et cetera, there was great internal relief that we were going to finally have some clear, consistent national direction on what the heck to do with all these roads and what to do with roadless. So what was in the final rule? The first rule. No new roads or reconstruction in inventory roadless areas were allowed, except for public safety and natural catastrophes, for federal highway projects, for conducting environmental cleanup, for outstanding statutory or treaty rights, to prevent resource damage, to rectify existing hazards, to timber harvest was prohibited, except to maintain or improve ecological conditions. That's a pretty big except. Or for incidental for other management activities that were going on, or for personal or administrative use, which covers firewood and other things. There was also going to be a transition period for the Tongass because they had a lot of outstanding timber projects, so it was not going to be implemented immediately on the Tongass. And also, there was an exception for any roads necessary for any existing mineral or oil and gas leases or leases that were being renewed. So it really had a fair degree of flexibility. That rule was published in January of 2001. Let me make a comment on the public involvement. Public involvement was ongoing from 1990 through 2000. There were over 600 meetings, and the Forest Service received over 1.2 comments, the most comments we'd ever received on anything, and they were in the majority positive comments. Between the announcement of the rule, or the final rule, there's a required 3-month period between announcement and implementation. That implementation date was extended to May of 2001. The Bush administration chose to amend the final rule. The amendments that they put forth was that the Tongass was not going to be included. That accounts for about 3 million acres of the total. And that governors can ask for exemptions for whatever reasons. The Bush administration also complained that there was insufficient public involvement, so they chose to have no public meetings, but it still generated 726,000 comments, again the majority in favor and supporting the roadless rule. Let's look a little deeper at the public comment or public response. In 1999, American Viewpoint, a GOP polling firm, conducted an extensive poll and concluded that 76% of Americans supported protecting roadless areas, 54% of those strongly, 19% opposed, 15% strongly opposed, and also of those supporting or of Republicans, 62% supported protection of roadless area. There were other polls that were done in 2003, 11 different states, and many of those in the Intermountain West or in high timber production states. The average was 74% supported the original level of protection that was proposed in the final rule. So I don't think it's very nebulous how the public feels about what's happening on their land or what should happen. Let's take a quick look at the legal situation. The 8 states and the District of Columbia appealed the original rule. In Idaho, the Idaho Federal District Court issued a preliminary injunction on implementation of the rule in May of 2001. The administration declined to defend that. The Forest Service then instituted some interim protection until that issue was clarified. The Ninth Circuit Court reversed the Idaho ruling and remanded it in April 2003. The Wyoming Federal District Court then struck down the roadless rule in July of 2003. Now that's moving forward in appeal, but also something else that's very interesting that's going forward with in that particular decision. Judge Bremer was the judge that made that decision. Half of Judge Bremer's personal investments, valued at somewhere between $400,000 and $1.1 million, $400,000 and $1.1 million. Half of his investments are invested in 15 different oil and gas companies, which would stand to benefit substantially from the roadless rule being overturned. So needless to say, there is an ethics question and conflict of interest involved here, and that is being pursued as well. The other states that have challenged the ruling are waiting to see what happens in Wyoming and Idaho before proceeding. So the story's not done yet. Quickly, let me talk about the arguments for and against roadless. I think I'll just focus on the against. Of course, one of the initial arguments was economics. There was the question of jobs and income. Totaling up every possible job, the final analysis by the Forest Service said that over the long term, this rule would produce 4,000 new jobs. Now, considering the fact that in the past 2+ years we've lost 2.5 million jobs, that plus pales by comparison, and also that was an estimate and long term. And what we've seen of other estimates, such as the estimates under the salvage rider, that was a sadly mistaken number. From 1969 to 1999, in metropolitan and non-metropolitan counties with greater than 10% roadless, the average employment grew 1.5 times faster than counties without that level of, than other western counties without that level of roadless. likewise, the income in rural counties that had greater than 10% roadless grew 1.3 times faster than counties that did not have roadless. And there seems to be no evidence yet put forward that roadless wilderness national parks or monuments correlates with a reduction in employment and income in communities. That's not to say there aren't communities impacted by this decision, and I think you'll read in my paper I try to make a strong case for transition policies and for restoration, emphasis on restoration, on getting in there, managing the roaded areas to get rid of that fuel loading, which, by the way, is not from lack of forest management, it's from fire suppression. 90 years of fire suppression have led to the level of fuel loading that we see now. So that is a very serious issue. And I will put in a plug for the Forest Service, though, because 98% of fires are suppressed and never become catastrophic. So what we're seeing is just a very small segment of the fire scenario. Fire, I addressed that in my paper also. I'll refer you to that. But you'll note that 12% of roaded areas that have been under intense management are considered at very high risk for fire. These figures are coming from the Roadless Area Conservation Rule EIS. Only 3% of roadless are considered at that high of risk. So in summary, excuse me, protecting roadless just makes common sense. We've got plenty to do. We can keep ourselves busy for more than 20 years with restoration and rehabilitation projects in already roaded areas. Those are the areas where humans are the most, where our houses are, where people are actively recreating. Those are the areas that need attention first. Also, we don't need to build any more roads when we can't maintain what we already have. Okay, I've already said this basically, but again, I'll repeat it. A focus on restoration and rehabilitation will provide a lot of work for communities that are located adjacent to these areas, people who have the skills, interest, and desire to be in there working in the woods. We can also get a sustainable supply of resources by these activities in roaded areas. 50% of all national forest areas are already roaded and managed. We've got plenty to work with right now. Management of our natural resources has a much higher payback to the American public if we're doing it in roaded areas. It has a very low payback in unroaded. And I submit probably the most important reason of all to protect roadless. I have 2 grandchildren. I want them to have options for the future. If we road everything we can possibly get a road into now and try to manage everything we can get our hands on, and frankly, we have a pretty poor track record of quality management, I want my grandkids to have options. And so I submit to you that the smartest thing to do is just take care of what we've already messed up before we go messing up anything more. Thank you.
We have time for questions and discussion.
I have a question, Chip Collins. Someone both of you, and it's not something that was touched on. 100 years is a very amiable time frame to talk about wildlife or forestry service management in this country. Indeed, we often started before that period in the Southeast. The Southeast is where I live, and I tend to work where I live. Each one reach one where they are, I hope. Our forest isn't the same forest as it was 100 years ago. 100 years ago, our forest was white oak, beech, walnut. Today, it's predominantly these species intermixed with white pine, which we've introduced to a density which is not normal. It carries insects in patches. You have a white pine standing alone in the forest is a really healthy tree. What do we do with forests that are not the forest of our grandfathers, and probably not the forest as our global community shrinks of our grandchildren? How then will we manage these? From either one of you.
Go ahead. Excellent question. And really, I think we have to adjust our sights because there really is no going back. I mean, it would be nice You know, we look at these pictures such as Charlie was talking about. She's right. You know, in certain habitat types, such as ponderosa pine, you know, maybe even 5 to 7 trees per acre was the norm. But what we can do is start applying some intelligent techniques to try to manage what we've got, what we've dealt ourselves, essentially. Certainly, removal of brush, reduction in densities, going for the smaller trees in the understory. We've only got, depending on what studies you read, on national forest land, they claim about 10% is still in old growth, but nationwide, I think we're closer to 2 or 3%. We need to maintain old growth, not just for all the benefits that existing old growth has, but we need to maintain that genetic pool. You know, we don't know what genetics are suggesting that why these trees have lived so long and are so hardy, but we sure better save it before we move on and decide to reduce it to board feet. I think that we need to be very careful about what species we introduce. White pine was introduced because it's a good and fast-growing, cheap source of lumber. Sometimes we introduce species, do I have to mention kudzu, that we think have a very good, will have a very good effect, and suddenly we find ourselves in an almost untenable situation. So I think that paying a lot more attention to what science is telling us is step one. We have a long history of ignoring what science has told us. So fire suppression, science was telling us in the 1940s that fire suppression was a bad idea, but it wasn't one we wanted to hear. We also have to get much more accustomed to prescribed burning. Prescribed burning, we talk about it a lot, and indeed the Forest Service has tried very hard to reintroduce prescribed burning, but if it's going to smoke out a town, particularly if it's a tourist town that depends on summer trade, or if people have asthma, or if it's somebody's favorite hunting or fishing area, they really don't want to see prescribed burns in there. Also, prescribed burns are, the best time to do it is when nature burns. Well, if you burn when nature burns, you have a high probability of that fire escaping. And so between the liability and the public resistance to the actual implementation, everybody loves the idea of prescribed fire, but when it comes to actual implementation, there's huge pushback. And I also think we need to look at the budgets within the Forest Service, and we need to start recognizing that, yes, we do need to reinvest in our natural capital. We've been very good about extracting, but we haven't been good at all about reinvesting. And we need to just bite the bullet and say we're going to have to pay for thinning. You know, hopefully we can find things to do with the materials that we bring out. Biomass energy looks very promising. But anyhow, I could go on and on, but essentially those are where I think some areas that we need to address, but we face tremendous social and political obstacles to modifying the status quo.
In talking to this, in North Carolina, we have 80 million acres of forest lands, 90% of which are privately owned. The vast majority of those are owned by non-industrial private forest landowners, as opposed to the company landowners. What lessons, it seems like a common theme here is that sound forest management is critical. There are different views on what sound forest management is, I think. But what lessons, if any, do the public forest lands, provide to states in the southeast like North Carolina for private forest management? And just to put it into a little more perspective, the advantage of a national forest is you typically have one land manager who can zone a very large piece of land and dedicate each piece to different uses. We have 700,000 forest landowners in North Carolina, each with different motivations, different economic needs, different levels of education. So again, what lessons, if any, does the public forest example provide to the southeastern United States, which is currently under intense pressure? Its forests are under unprecedented pressure to produce fiber.
Would you like to?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right. It kind of is. It depends upon what your definition is on management. But again, I like to use the term maintenance instead of management. I think that what we have to do is we have to make sure that we do clear out the brush. We've seen the impact of the brush, and that would be for national forests as well as for private lands as well. I think that we do need to promote the prescribed burns, and again, that is something that this administration, I think, is trying to do. I think that the word management makes people think that you are going to go in and micromanage what is going on, and that is a concern that we have. I mean, I think that we need to have the flexibility for the managers, the experts, the forest experts, to go in and to do what they do best, and to take care of the forest. And they are the experts. They're the ones that know what has to be done. We have the technology, we have the know-how. The problem has been that we've had a policy where we're not going in and we're not managing, we're not taking care of the forests, and I think that we need to have proactive management of the forests.
If I could take a shot at that as well, I think one of the lessons that you see that you can transfer from public land to private is the benefits of diversity, and the benefits of moving a habitat towards its highest or its best condition. I mean, we know what different habitat types require in terms of density, in terms of species diversity, and moving towards that for the individual landowner is a good idea. However, having said that, we'll also say, we don't want a patchwork of everyone, 2 acres here, very diverse, 2 acres there. It also needs to be looked at in the context of the larger landscape. If the landowner has a lot of land, then they can look at diversity within their own landscape. But one of the things that has happened, I think a wonderful example that the Forest Service has participated in are cooperative resource management plans, where an entire watershed is looked at and all the owners within that watershed come together and figure out how to collectively and cooperatively manage the entire watershed. And I don't know if this program exists in the East, but in Montana, we also have a program where the state sponsors stewardship training. And we actually have people who spend a week with landowners teaching them about the principles of stewardship and how to develop a management plan for their own property based on their own personal goals, be they production of fiber or its wildlife, whatever, but it gives someone the tools and the economic support to develop a plan that they can move their property towards a long-term sustainable forest that's going to give them the benefits that they're seeking. So those are our 3 thoughts in that regard.
Okay, I have 2 questions for Charlie Coon. The first is a question about the nature of the fires that are burning on federal forest lands. You talked a lot about catastrophic, high-intensity fires that sterilize the soil and damage wildlife. And I'm wondering, I guess, what percentage of the fires that have burned over the past few years fit that characterization? Because we do know that there are other fires that burn at moderate intensities or variable intensities. The typical patterns in a lot of forest fires is sort of a mosaic pattern across the landscape. That was something I saw when I lived in Montana for 6 years. And I'm wondering, so first, what percentage of the fires that we're seeing now fit the characterization in your paper? And second, and in relation to that, how our fire policy should be sensitive to the variation in fire across the landscape. So that's my first question. My second question is about your discussion of environmental impact statements. You talked about environmental impact statements. I think you characterized them as roadblocks, that we spent too much time doing analysis and not enough time doing management on the ground. If that's the case, I'm wondering, and you'd like to reduce or streamline the EIS process, I'm wondering what mechanism you would put in place as a substitute to ensure that we retain some kind of accountability and public input into the forest decision-making process.
Well, first of all, many of the fires, and I think we've already discussed this today, that a lot of the fires is because we're having these because we have the dense underbrush, and we haven't been in there, we haven't been removing that, we haven't been harvesting the forest, and therefore, when you have a fire, it is going to be extremely hot, and potentially catastrophic. In terms of the exact percent, I don't know. I can give you the data in terms of what years. The 2000 was the first fire season in 50 years, and that means that we lost a lot of forest land, a lot of valuable forest land. We lost habitat, and it polluted the air and the water. So again, we need to be proactive. We need to go in, and we need to maintain our forests. In terms of the environmental impact statements, I view the environmental impact statements as well as a lot of the other regulations, whether they be environmental regulations, whether they be OSHA regulations or whatever. A lot of these are just they are dilatory tactics. What happens is, instead of being able to move forward, what you're constantly doing is you're appealing and arguing over these impact statements. In the meantime, people that need, perhaps maybe they might need a road, maybe you want to stop a road, it just stops. Everything gets bottlenecked, and that's the problem with the whole bureaucratic process that we've got in Washington, D.C. You have people in Washington that are telling people on the West Coast and telling everybody else what to do, and these just become dilatory processes. The litigation, as I said, most of the litigation that we've seen on the appeals for forest projects have been frivolous lawsuits. Again, it's a way to just slow the process up to ensure that we don't have projects move forward, and I think that it's being abused by many of the extremists. Having said that, I'm not saying we shouldn't have rules. Yes, we should have rules, and there should be rules of the road. But I personally believe, and my organization believes, that we've just got too much government. We've got too much government micromanaging what everybody does. Let's give them the flexibility. If you're a manager and you're a forest manager and you have that expertise, then you should have the flexibility to be able to implement your plan, and you should not have bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. telling you what to do. And we see too much of that. I've seen that for years. That's been my life, is the legislative process and the bureaucracy. And these rules and regulations are oftentimes abused and just used to stop projects.
Okay, I'm a student at the Nicholas School, and I'm studying forest fire and landscape ecology. And so I just had a question for Charlie. And there's no argument from me, and I think from the scientific community, that forest management has altered the structure of ecosystems with short fire turn intervals, such as the ponderosa pine or the chaparral, which burn every 10 to 50 years. However, there's a whole suite of ecosystems that have 100 to 400 year intervals, such as the lodgepole pine. And so reason would state that this hands-off policy has very little impact on ecosystems that burn within the 100 and 400 year time frame. And I spent the past summer working in Yellowstone, and there they had a really active prescribed burning program from 1973 to 88, and it did nothing to stop the catastrophic wildfires that we did see in 1988. And so I was just wondering, it sounds like you're advocating for us to change the structure of these forests, and is that really possible? Do you think that we can do that, and will that stop the catastrophic wildfire occurrence in these long-term fire return interval ecosystems?
Well, again, what I'm talking about is sound management, and I'm not going to second guess the forest managers out there and the experts in the field in terms of what their necessities are. Again, we have to have the sound management, and you're right. In terms of like 100 years, we do not have a policy generally on anything that lasts for 100 years, because the times do change. But I think that for most forest managers, they would agree that we need to ensure that we go in and we clear the underbrush so that we don't have these tinderboxes. It doesn't mean that every fire is going to be a catastrophic fire. It doesn't mean that we're going to have forest fires, but there's that potential of a catastrophic forest fire there. So what we need to do is we need to ensure that we are taking action to prevent or at least minimize the impacts of these catastrophic fires.
Even in ecosystems that are sort of adapting to this catastrophic wildfire cycle?
I think that what we need to do is we need to manage them, and if the management is hands off in those areas, then so be it. But I don't think that we need to have one policy that applies to a cookie cutter size policy, if you will.
Here and then up there.
This is Charlene. Just hearing your organization's perspective on the Healthy Forest Bill and the constraints on decision-making out there in the field that exist under the present system. I'm sorry to pull you away from forest, but I'm wondering what your organization thinks about efforts that are succeeding in Congress, or at least the progressive Congress, to impose layers of review and burdens of proof and peer review on Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service in their administration of the Endangered Species Act, so-called sound science bills.
I think that in terms of the sound science, we certainly have been trying to promote that, and I think that we're seeing some results, perhaps, with the Data Quality Act. I mean, the Data Quality Act should have some teeth in it. I'm not sure at this particular time that it does. We've had some small victories in that in terms of the Climate Action Report, which was not based on the Data Quality Act. It was not subjected to the Data Quality Act, and now, at least on their website, they are actually saying that we need the sound science. Again, if we're going to have rules and we're going to have regulations, then we need to base these and make sure that there is the data to back those up. And we've seen too many examples in Washington, D.C., one being the Mercury, one being the Climate Action Report, where you have proprietary models that they will not share with the general public. They won't share with other scientists. And if EPA or somebody is going to say that there has to be a certain reduction or a certain limit, and they're basing it on a particular model, then somebody should be able to look at those models, because everybody in this room, is paying for those models. It's taxpayers' money that's paying for those, because EPA is then spending their money for proprietary models, which you can't see.
Just as a follow-up, then, what level of data quality and data support and data review do you support under the Healthy Forest Initiative for actions that would be taken under the authority of that bill?
I'm not sure if I follow you follow your question on that. The Data Quality Act would indeed apply to the Healthy Forest Act in terms of the science that would be involved in the practices.
Do you think there's enough time, though, given the time frame for review of decisions, to actually apply data quality review to the decisions under the Healthy Forest Initiative? It's, 30 days?
Well, I think that if the Data Quality Act should have some teeth, and I don't think that it does right now.
Chris has given me the indication that I can take one more question, and there's a gentleman in the back row in the checked shirt. You're looking, but yes, you've been waiting so patiently. So this will unfortunately have to be our last question, Chris is
This
saying.
is a follow-up question that will touch on the points of many of the questions that were made. Will eventually be a question for both of you, but Ms. Coon, I was struck by your use of the word natural in your talk, and characterizing these, so-called catastrophic crown fires as unnatural. I would question the timescale on which you're talking about those. And so you took 100 years as the timescale by talking about that photograph. I guess the question for both of you is, how would you define natural? And so I think that'll bring out the distinctions between the points of view between maybe both of you.
Well, the natural would be when we go back to what the country was at the beginning of the United States. And when you look at what the beginning of the United States was, you did have people. You had the Native Americans here. They had to cut down trees. They had to burn trees to use those in the past, and that's where the density issue comes into place. That we go back to the natural, quote unquote, state of the forest. And right now, it's not healthy for the forest when we have a density that when it's 10 times the density, because again, you're fighting for those nutrients, you're fighting for the water, and it just is susceptible to disease and infection. So again, I would say that we go back to what the forests were like, as I said, of course that was I said 100 years, but when you go back to what it was naturally when the United States was formed.
I have a slightly different perspective. We like to talk about pre-European settlement conditions, and actually the Native American communities were very active in managing their environment. They didn't have chainsaws or logging trucks, but and they didn't really harvest that many trees per se, not in a level that you would expect or that you would think that we as we do now. But they used fire extensively to modify their environment, and so the use of fire, they were watching what was happening naturally, and indeed there were catastrophic fires. I mean, we can go back and look at dendrochronology, the counting of tree rings, looking at tree rings, and that tells us that there were indeed very regular fire cycles, as the young woman in front of you mentioned, that in some habitat types those could be as much as 400 years or longer in their cycles. So I think that I go back to my assertion that we need to think about the habitat types that we're operating in, and indeed what is considered a climax in that particular habitat type, and what serial stage are we going to set it back to with our management. But doing that with the intention of we will set it back to an earlier stage in its development, but then we will be proceeding to allow it to go forward then to its climax. Now, well, I'll stop there. The burning is very important, and I think, again, absolutely, without doubt. I mean, I have spent decades talking to scientists about this and been in the field, fighting fire, working with fire, trying to manage wildfire, working with scientists to go back and review the effects of fire. And I think that sometimes we get a little too excited because we have very short time frames that we think in. Another woman asked a question about the percent of the truly, soil sterilizing fire. That is typically 10 to 15% of a catastrophic fire. Of course, sometimes larger, but usually that's the average. So I think we see a burned landscape and we absolutely lose it. Oh my God, this isn't anything like it. Well, I invite many of you, all of you, to go back to Yellowstone and look 12 years later at the remarkable recovery, even in areas where we thought there was not going to be recovery. Now, lodgepole pine is the predominant species there in Yellowstone that burn. So we're getting a unique opportunity to watch nature recover and rehabilitate. I could go on and on. I would love to talk about EISs and their real purpose.
There will be additional time to ask questions of both Charlie and Gloria during the open discussion at the end. And Chris has just shown me a note that says instead of a 15-minute break right now, if everyone could take a very fast 5-minute break to try and get us back on track. Thank you very much again.